The decision lasted only seconds, but its meaning struck the royal family like a thunderclap. Lady Louise Windsor stood before Catherine and placed the Queen's diamond brooch into her hands, transforming a private inheritance into an unmistakable statement of trust. But the real shock came moments later. Queen Camilla had already appealed for the transfer to be reconsidered, and Louise refused. No delay, no compromise. And suddenly, one small jewel seemed powerful enough to divide an entire palace. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Louise had never treated the brooch as an ordinary piece of jewelry. It carried an intensely personal connection to Queen Elizabeth II, and had come into her care through a private family arrangement linked to the late monarch's personal possessions. A private family arrangement means a decision handled within the family rather than through official crown ownership, giving Louise unusual authority over what happened next. To her, this was not simply a diamond object. It was memory, trust, and responsibility compressed into something small enough to hold in one hand. The central event could not have been clearer. Louise personally gave the brooch to Catherine, Princess of Wales, and refused Camilla's earlier appeal that the jewel remain outside Catherine's possession. The princess did not accept it casually. She asked Louise twice whether she was certain, almost as though she understood the consequences before anyone said them aloud. Only then did Catherine close her fingers around the brooch and admit that accepting something so closely associated with Elizabeth felt less like receiving jewelry and more like being entrusted with someone's memory. Camilla learned the outcome in a private sitting room. An aide explained that Louise considered the matter settled, and the Queen's expression hardened. What wounded her was not the loss of an object she had owned. She had never owned it. The deeper sting came from realizing that her position as Queen had not been enough to change the younger royal's decision. Louise had known exactly what she was doing. Camilla's appeal had come before the handover, not afterward. She could have delayed. She could have sent the brooch through staff. Instead, Louise insisted on giving it directly to Catherine, making the transfer personal and impossible to dismiss as an administrative misunderstanding. Catherine looked down at the brooch after accepting it, still visibly moved. Louise broke the silence with one quiet sentence. She would want it worn, not argued over. The princess could not answer immediately. That left the palace facing two uncomfortable questions. Why had Louise become so determined to place Elizabeth's brooch with Catherine, and why had Camilla tried to stop it before the transfer happened? Because behind Louise's refusal was not sudden rebellion. It was a loyalty built over years, and Catherine was only one part of the story. To understand why the brooch became so explosive, you have to understand the three women standing on opposite sides of it. Lady Louise was not chasing royal influence. Catherine had not demanded the jewel. And Camilla's objection was about far more than diamonds. Each woman saw the same heirloom differently. One saw a grandmother, another saw duty, and the third saw the dangerous possibility that royal memory was quietly moving toward the next generation without her. Louise had known Queen Elizabeth II in a way that rank could never fully explain. To the public, Elizabeth had been sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch and the symbolic head of the crown. To Louise, she was also Granny, a woman whose approval often arrived through quiet attention rather than grand declarations. Because Louise spent much of her childhood outside the brightest royal spotlight, that relationship felt private and deeply personal. The brooch therefore carried something no title could measure. It represented memory before status, and Louise became fiercely protective of that distinction. Catherine stood in a very different place. As the woman expected one day to become queen beside William, every heirloom linked to Elizabeth carried enormous symbolic weight around her. She did not need the brooch to establish her position, but any object connected with the late monarch could become part of the visible bridge between one reign and the next. Catherine understood that reality, and it was exactly why she had never asked Louise about the jewel. She wanted no suggestion that affection, inheritance, or memory had been pursued for advantage. Camilla saw the transfer through another lens. As queen, She understood how easily symbols could become judgments. Being bypassed made her fear that family confidence, affection, and legitimacy were quietly flowing toward Catherine while the current reign was still unfolding. The Queen did not need to own the brooch to feel its meaning. She needed to know whether the family was beginning to treat the future as emotionally more important than the present. Catherine learned about Camilla's objection only after Louise had already arrived for the private handover. Her instinct was immediate. She told the younger royal she would not accept something that might deepen family damage. Louise refused that escape route just as quickly. If Catherine stepped away merely because a more senior royal objected, she argued, then a loving decision would become exactly what Louise feared: a contest over rank. Catherine finally asked, "Is this about me?" Louise paused. "No, it's about what Granny trusted us to understand." That answer changed the meaning of everything. Louise was not crowning Catherine through jewelry or rejecting Camilla as queen. She was protecting what she believed Elizabeth had taught them. Memory should not automatically belong to whoever stands highest. And that belief had been born months earlier, during one uncomfortable royal gathering, when a single conversation changed Louise's mind for good. The conflict did not begin on the day Catherine received the brooch. Its real beginning came months earlier, during what should have been an uneventful family gathering at Windsor. There, one conversation about the late Queen's jewelry stopped Lady Louise cold. Nobody shouted, nobody issued an order. But by the time she left that room, Louise had reached a private conclusion. One particular diamond brooch would never be allowed to become a symbol of seniority, competition, or possession. Louise had kept the brooch stored privately because its meaning still felt too personal to disturb. The family was adjusting to a new reign, but grief had not moved at the same speed as titles and duties. A new reign simply means the period beginning when a new monarch takes the throne. And for Louise, that transition had changed the family around her without changing what the jewel meant. Catherine had already worn several pieces linked to Queen Elizabeth II, yet she had never once asked about this brooch. That silence mattered. Louise began to see restraint as evidence that the princess understood the difference between inheritance and possession. The turning point came during a private Windsor family reception following a Commonwealth service. The Commonwealth service is a formal royal event celebrating the group of nations connected through the Commonwealth. And afterward, conversation turned toward which of Elizabeth's jewels might return at future ceremonial occasions. Camilla spoke calmly, arguing that historically significant pieces should remain aligned with the reigning queen's household whenever possible. To everyone else, it sounded like an orderly discussion about continuity. To Louise, one phrase landed differently: the reigning queen's household. Louise barely spoke after that. The brooch had belonged to her grandmother in a deeply personal way, and she could not accept the idea that rank should automatically decide its future. Catherine noticed her withdrawing from the conversation. Rather than support a claim of her own, she deliberately changed the subject. Louise remembered that choice because the princess had been given a perfect chance to strengthen her own position and refused to do it. Louise returned to the brooch later that evening. She opened the storage case for the first time in months and realized two things at once. She did not want Elizabeth's jewel hidden forever, but she also did not want institutional precedence, the formal order deciding who outranks whom, to dictate where it belonged. Louise placed the brooch back inside the case and closed the lid. Then she opened it again. That hesitation became the decision. Catherine would eventually receive it, not because she stood higher than anyone else, but because Louise believed she understood how to wear Elizabeth's legacy without claiming it as a prize. But private choices become dangerous once other people discover them, and when Camilla learned what Louise intended, restraint gave way to confrontation. Camilla did not send another aide. She did not hide behind protocol. Once she understood that Louise intended to give Catherine the brooch, the Queen requested a private conversation and made the appeal herself. What followed was not a screaming match. It was far more uncomfortable than that. Two women sat opposite each other, speaking carefully, because both understood exactly what was at stake. Camilla wanted reconsideration. Louise wanted her choice respected. Neither woman was willing to pretend the disagreement meant nothing. Camilla entered convinced the matter could still be resolved before Catherine became involved. She was not trying to seize the brooch or issue an order. Her argument was simpler. Keeping such a personal piece away from the future queen would prevent unnecessary symbolism from forming around it. Royal protocol means the traditions and expectations that guide conduct, rank, and sensitive decisions inside the monarchy. But the queen was trying to keep this discussion outside that formal machinery. Louise understood the difference. She had already rehearsed what she would say, because refusing Camilla directly carried far more emotional weight than ignoring a message delivered through staff. Camilla spoke first. "I'm asking you to reconsider, not ordering you." Louise acknowledged the distinction, but her answer remained firm. Her grandmother, she said, had taught her that personal gifts did not suddenly become institutional property simply because circumstances changed. To Louise, the brooch belonged to memory before it belonged to monarchy. The queen listened carefully, but the conversation tightened the moment Catherine's name entered it. Camilla asked whether Catherine had encouraged the transfer. Louise reacted immediately. The princess knew nothing about the decision, had never requested the brooch, and had never suggested that it should come to her. Louise defended Catherine because she refused to let another woman become the convenient explanation for a choice that had always been hers. That answer disturbed Camilla more than accusation would have. If Catherine had not sought the jewel, then ambition could not explain what was happening. Louise then revealed the detail that changed the confrontation. She had made her decision after the Windsor reception, the same gathering where Camilla had argued that significant jewels should remain aligned with the reigning queen. What the queen had considered a reasonable argument about continuity had sounded very different to Louise. She had heard ownership. Worse, Camilla now realized that her own words had helped trigger the outcome she was trying to stop. Camilla placed one hand flat on the table. "So there is nothing I can say?" Louise met her eyes. "Not about this." The queen slowly withdrew her hand. The emotional battle was over, but another question immediately took its place. Louise could defend her choice, but did she truly have the authority to make it without intervention from above? That question moved the dispute away from emotion and toward power, because even a grandmother's brooch becomes complicated when private inheritance collides with the machinery of monarchy. After the confrontation, attention shifted to the one person capable of changing the atmosphere with a single sentence: King Charles. Camilla expected her husband to understand why the transfer troubled her. Louise knew her uncle could make the disagreement unbearably difficult. Catherine wanted no part of a family battle. Yet when the question finally reached Charles, the king discovered something uncomfortable. This was one royal dispute, where exercising power could cost him far more than simply allowing the decision to stand. Charles received the full briefing, after Camilla's rejected appeal began creating tension inside the household. Advisors explained that the brooch was being treated as a personal family possession rather than an official crown jewel. A crown jewel is held for the monarchy as an institution, while a private possession can pass through the family according to personal wishes and arrangements. That distinction gave Louise unusual authority. If the king intervened now, he would not simply be settling a dispute. He would be turning a granddaughter's personal decision into a royal command. Charles felt the conflict immediately. Supporting Camilla mattered to him, and he understood why she felt excluded from a decision carrying so much symbolism. But Louise mattered too. The monarch remembered how strongly Queen Elizabeth II had protected personal family relationships from being swallowed by rank and duty. Overruling Louise might satisfy one immediate concern while sending a harsher message: that private affection remained valid only until someone more senior objected. Catherine reached the same emotional crossroads from another direction. She told William privately that if Charles asked for the brooch back, she would return it without argument. The prince pushed back. He understood her desire to protect the family, but he warned that surrendering the jewel now would humiliate Louise. It would make her carefully considered choice appear temporary. meaningful only until a more powerful royal stepped in. Catherine knew William was right, and that knowledge made the gift feel heavier rather than easier. Charles then received the detail that settled everything. Louise had left written confirmation describing the transfer as voluntary, personal, and final. She had not written it as a challenge to the monarch. She had written it to protect Catherine from any suggestion that the princess had sought, pressured, or maneuvered for Elizabeth's brooch. Charles read the statement twice. He removed his glasses and sat in silence before looking toward an aide. Then it remains her decision. The words carried more sadness than authority. By refusing to overrule Louise, the king effectively closed Camilla's institutional route to stopping the transfer. Camilla had not lost a title, a possession, or a formal right. That was precisely why the moment cut so deeply. She had simply reached a limit she had never expected to confront. And once that limit became undeniable, the argument stopped being about who could control the brooch and became about how Camilla would live with being told no. The most painful moment does not happen during the confrontation. It comes afterward, when there is nobody left to persuade. Camilla returns to her private rooms, knowing Louise will not reverse the gift, Catherine will not be asked to surrender it, and Charles will not intervene. For the first time, the rejection becomes personal. The Queen has not lost a jewel she owned. She has lost the ability to shape what that jewel will now represent. Camilla feels the decision settle around her more heavily than any argument. Staff are quietly told that Catherine's possession of the brooch is settled and that no further action is expected. A household instruction simply means a private direction to royal staff about how an issue should be handled, and this one leaves almost no room for ambiguity. Catherine, meanwhile, deliberately chooses not to wear the jewel straight away. She keeps it privately out of respect for Louise, and because appearing in it too soon could make the transfer look like a victory over the Queen rather than a personal gift. Camilla finds the silence harder than confrontation. There is no remaining procedure to challenge, no second appeal to make, and no compromise that lets everyone walk away claiming satisfaction. Charles visits her privately, and for the first time she explains what she had really been trying to prevent. She tells the king that she never wanted to take anything from Louise. She wanted to stop another symbol from being created that outsiders could use to compare one queen with another. Charles listens before giving the answer she least wants to hear. By trying to control the symbol, she has made it more powerful. Camilla finally admits the deeper fear. Every time Catherine receives something associated with Queen Elizabeth II, public attention seems to drift toward the future reign before the present one has finished. To her, each heirloom risks becoming another reminder that history is already preparing to move on. Charles understands the anxiety, but he refuses to blame Catherine for it. The line of succession, the fixed order determining who eventually inherits the throne, makes comparison unavoidable. The king tells her that resisting every sign of transition only makes that transition appear dangerous. Camilla remains seated after Charles leaves. She removes another brooch from her own jacket, places it on the table, and stares at it for several seconds. Then she asks an aide to cancel the rest of her private appointments. The gesture is quiet, but the meaning is devastating. She is not grieving a jewel. She is grieving control over the story surrounding it. Yet Catherine is suffering too. She never wanted to become the symbol at the center of Camilla's insecurity, and Louise begins to realize that the gift she meant as comfort has become a burden. That is why one final conversation becomes necessary without aides, without palace language, and without Camilla in the room. By the time Catherine asks Louise to meet privately, the brooch feels heavier than diamonds ever should. She worries that accepting it has wounded Camilla, divided the family, and turned Louise into an unwilling combatant. But Louise has something Catherine still does not understand. This was never a coronation by jewelry. It was never an attempt to humiliate the Queen. Behind a closed door, with no aides and no official record, Louise finally explains exactly why she chose Catherine. Catherine begins by making the offer she has been carrying for days. If keeping the brooch threatens Louise's relationship with the rest of the family, she will return it. A private family meeting, simply means a conversation held outside formal royal business, without staff shaping the wording or preserving an official account, and that freedom changes the tone immediately. Louise refuses the offer almost at once. She reminds Catherine that the decision existed long before the princess even knew she was being considered. This conflict, she insists, was never created by Catherine. Catherine finally admits what she has been afraid to say aloud. Receiving objects connected to Queen Elizabeth II can frighten her. Each heirloom feels like another reminder of the enormous role waiting in the future, another expectation she may fail to meet, another comparison she never asked anyone to make. Louise listens closely because she understands that what appears like privilege from the outside can feel like pressure from within. The younger royal had meant the brooch as trust, not another burden. Louise then admits her own discomfort. Camilla's hurt troubles her more than she expected. She never wanted to embarrass the queen, and she regrets that a private family choice became emotionally charged. But she refuses to confuse regret with surrender. Changing the decision now, she tells Catherine, would mean allowing conflict to rewrite the meaning of the gift. Louise finally explains why the choice had always felt right. She remembers watching Catherine speak to Elizabeth at family gatherings without performing for her, flattering her, or treating her first as monarch. The princess spoke naturally, with respect but without fear. Louise says her grandmother valued that steadiness. On one private occasion, Elizabeth had described Catherine's strength not as glamour or rank, but as her ability to remain calm when everyone around her became unsettled. Louise carried those words with her long after the conversation ended. Louise reaches across the table and closes Catherine's fingers around the brooch case. Don't wear it because you're next. Wear it because you remember her. Catherine's eyes fill. This time, she does not offer to give it back. The gift finally makes sense in private, but private meaning rarely survives untouched once the monarchy steps into public view. And when Catherine eventually wears Elizabeth's diamonds, one photograph will transform a family conversation into a national judgment. The palace can keep conversations private. It cannot keep diamonds invisible forever. When Catherine finally appears wearing the Queen's brooch at a major royal engagement, photographers capture the piece immediately. Within minutes, the image is everywhere. Yet the picture that grips the public is not merely Catherine wearing Elizabeth's jewel. It is another frame taken moments later, Catherine touching the brooch while speaking quietly to Lady Louise. Suddenly, millions of people understand that this is not simply jewelry, it is a message. Catherine had waited deliberately before wearing it. She chose a formal engagement centered on service and continuity rather than personal celebration, making the brooch feel connected to duty instead of triumph. Louise attended as well, which mattered because her presence immediately weakened any suggestion that the princess had taken the jewel and distanced herself from the woman who gave it. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's main administrative base for official royal communications, issued only a restrained confirmation that the brooch had been a private gift from Louise to Catherine. The palace said nothing about Camilla's earlier objection. Camilla watched the coverage from another royal residence and understood the symbolism instantly. This was exactly what she had feared. Louise's private gift was now being folded into the public story of succession, with Catherine appearing as the woman carrying Elizabeth's memory toward the future. The Queen knew Catherine had not created that interpretation, but knowing that did not make it easier to watch. Louise felt the pressure from the opposite direction. When photographers repeatedly focused on the brooch, she became nervous, suddenly aware that a family decision had become public property. Catherine noticed and deliberately moved toward her afterward, beginning an ordinary conversation rather than leaving Louise isolated, as though she had made some political statement against Camilla. The gesture was small, but it protected the younger royal from becoming a weapon in somebody else's argument. Then the tone of the story changed. One broadcaster described the moment not as Catherine defeats Camilla, but as Elizabeth's memory passes quietly to a new generation. That framing stripped away some of the rivalry and replaced it with legacy. The following morning, A London newspaper ran a full-page photograph of Catherine touching the brooch beside Louise, beneath the headline, "The Queen's Diamonds, a Granddaughter's Choice." Later that day, a small crowd outside Windsor applauded as Louise's car passed through the gates. Louise saw the newspaper before breakfast and looked horrified by the size of the headline. Her mother reassured her that she had made a family decision, not a public declaration. That distinction mattered, even if the world had blurred it. Now only one emotional task remained. Catherine, Louise, Camilla, and Charles had to decide whether the brooch would divide them permanently or teach them what succession actually required. The answer would not come from another appeal, another headline, or another royal command. It would come from what each of them chose to do once there was nothing left to fight over. In the end, nobody lost a crown. Nobody surrendered a title. Yet, one diamond brooch exposed something far more difficult inside the monarchy. The painful moment when memory begins moving from one generation to another. Louise had defended a grandmother. Catherine had accepted a responsibility she never requested. Camilla had confronted the fear of being bypassed. And Charles had discovered that sometimes preserving the family means refusing to exercise the power of a king. Now came the final reckoning. Catherine allowed time to cool what anger had sharpened. She continued wearing the brooch selectively, choosing moments where its connection to Queen Elizabeth II felt meaningful rather than decorative. Louise noticed that restraint, and it reassured her that the gift had not become a trophy. Charles reached a similar conclusion from another direction. When advisors suggested creating clearer rules for future personal heirlooms, the king rejected the idea. Royal protocol means the customs that guide official conduct and precedence, but he believed forcing every private family object into such rules would erase the relationships those objects were supposed to represent. Camilla eventually asked Louise for another private conversation. This time, the Queen did not appeal the decision or ask for the brooch to be reconsidered. She admitted that her first response had come partly from fear. Every piece associated with Elizabeth that moved toward Catherine seemed likely to become another public judgment on her own place. Louise listened carefully. She told Camilla that she had never intended to reject her as queen. She had simply refused to let love for her grandmother be reorganized according to rank. The distinction still hurt, but Camilla finally accepted that hurt did not make Louise's choice an attack. Catherine later spoke to Camilla directly. She promised she would never wear Elizabeth's possessions as weapons of comparison or as proof that one woman mattered more than another. Camilla answered with the truth she had resisted from the beginning. Comparison could not be controlled by hiding objects. Trying to prevent it had only made the brooch more powerful and the wound deeper. The final proof came at their next family gathering. Catherine wore the brooch. Camilla noticed it immediately, paused, then deliberately complimented the piece in front of Louise. The younger royal smiled. Catherine quietly touched the Queen's arm, and nobody reopened the argument. The silence this time was not hostile. It was acceptance. Louise's refusal ultimately meant something larger than defiance. It showed that continuity inside the monarchy cannot survive through possession alone. Elizabeth's legacy belongs not simply to whoever holds the highest position, but to those trusted to carry her memory forward with restraint. Catherine kept the brooch. Louise stood by her decision. Camilla abandoned her appeal. Charles accepted the outcome. What threatened to become a battle between present and future instead became a painful lesson in letting go and in accepting that royal generations must overlap before one finally gives way to another. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.